Okay, so welcome back. This is still week 3 and this is part 2 of this week's recording. And before you kick off, I'd like to encourage you to actually have a look at this short YouTube clip from Western University about how to read a scholarly article. You may have already seen it, which is good if you have. If not, it just is a little refresher of how to cut to the chase, if you like. When you read a scholarly article, and it's pretty humorous too, so pretty good one. Okay, as we in the second part start to get kind of closer to what you're trying to do, particularly in preparation as well for your pitch about your research and what your current thinking is, which is your assessment next week. Just keep in mind, as we read critically, we identify the main arguments and the conclusions drawn, we assess the strength of the evidence given in support of arguments and conclusions, and we identify the implied assumptions, where the author is coming from, if you like, in respect to moral, political, value judgments, approaches, scholarly approach as well sometimes. And in particular, we're thinking, how does this inform your question, your topic? When we write critically, which you do in a literature review, you present logical arguments which lead to your conclusions. We provide sound evidence and reasons to support it. And we evaluate, select, organise and categorise theories and findings to provide a coherent framework. Again, that forms the basis of our research. So I've put up, this is one of your tasks for this week as well. I'm not actually going to dwell on it so much, but think back to the feedback I gave you on your review of a qualitative paper last week and select one of the quantitative readings from this week. And again, think of what are the research questions, what sort of methodology is used in respect to collecting data and analysing the data, what are the implications, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the data collection methods used to answer the research questions, and the discussion of the findings, again linking back to the research that they've drawn on. Because these are quantitative papers you're looking at, the idea is obviously that that theory should inform what they came up with, and sometimes they're separated, so you've got findings and then a discussion, and sometimes they're integrated. But the idea is there to be quite deductive. You've got one example which is from a student, an undergraduate student who was doing a practitioner research project. So obviously those sample sizes are quite small. He was doing it during his placement, whereas the other ones are published papers. Okay, I'm going to leave those, but I'm going to flag one thing which is quite important when we're looking at quantitative data, because quite often we see those somewhat mysterious numbers of p-values, which is actually an indication of the probability of a statistical error, or of the finding actually representing something that is not what they're measuring in that test. And we see p-values of 0.5 or 0.01, 0.05 I should say, or 0.01. The smaller number is stronger because it means that it's a smaller probability of there being an error in the sampling. But we also need to consider, okay, the size of the sample size in a quantitative study in particular, because the idea is obviously to seek to generalize the results as much as possible. Good idea that they're indicating the effect sizes of the measurements that they're coming up with, and Cohen's D, so you often see a D and then a size to indicate the strength of a relationship. I'm just going to cheat sheet one thing. And when we're looking at effect sizes, those of you who've come across Hattie's work would probably be familiar. Effect sizes are classified as small, which is an effect size of less than 0.20, to medium, which is about 0.40 to 60, and strong is 0.80. In respect to the size of an effect in regard to teaching implication, the general size of teaching strategies that we use is an effect size of 0.40, which indicates kind of a year's growth of students. So anything that's higher than that is generally an indication that that particular teaching strategy actually makes quite a big difference in respect to students gaining results. That was a bit of a tangent, but I'm just letting you know, because a lot of the time, particularly when we look at quantitative studies, we see those numbers and sometimes we don't know what they mean, but that's what they mean. And those, again, a good paper doesn't just give you the numbers, it actually gives you, again, the interpretation and what that indicates and unpacks it. If it's a qualitative study, we need to consider if it's, so what you looked at last week, if it's purposeful in its sampling, because they're going to pick key people to give meaningful accounts, whereas if it's a quantitative, we're looking at often probability sample and some sort of a random sampling approach. I'm going to talk more about sampling later on in this course, but it's just there to kind of flag an awareness for you as you engage with the literature. When we review literature as well, and the reason why you're doing is because it leads into the key ideas that inform your understanding as you're pitching your research, both in your proposal and in your presentation next week. We need to take a position in relation to what we're reading, whether we agree or disagree, and why. And that's really where you're building your arguments, that's where you're showing your critical engagement. You might post questions raised, which is a really good idea of showing your critical thinking. You've got another video clip. Again, you've got a direct link in respect to evaluating sources that you can view in your own time. It's another good one from the Western University. So getting kind of more to the nitty-gritty, the steps of a literature review. And a literature review, the reason why I keep talking about it is because it underpins so much of what you do, and you're actually going to continue on reading all throughout this subject, and also when you do Researcher B, because the findings that you're generating, you're constantly building on. So it's a bit like this Escher picture of an infinite picture where you just go around in circles, if you like, but you keep building on the knowledge that you've got. So you will keep on drawing on this, and you will use, when you put your first assessment in your draft proposal, you will then continue to fine-tune that in your major assessment piece, which is the proposal, which is assessment B. So it's not like you're going to come up with something new. You're going to use the writing you've already got, but you're going to edit it and tweak it and shorten it and sharpen it and so on, and build on it as well. And it's the same thing later on when you actually report on your research. Eventually, when you generate your report, you actually, again, connect back to all that literature you have reviewed, and you will use the segments of it. So you're not going to be plagiarizing yourself. The assumption is that you're drawing on what you're writing. This is the task, what we're actually going to do. And we're going to start identifying concepts, because remember, oops, hang on. Go back. I'm going the wrong way. Remembering that a literature review is conceptually organized in a synthesis of ideas. So in order to do that, we actually need to identify some concepts. And this is one of your tasks and success criteria for this week. So you're going to identify questions that relate and help you answer your research question. This is where those little snippets and the annotations are really helpful, because they give us a short, sharp version. So you need to make sure that you continue being in the habit of developing those as you read. And I'm going to give you an example of a paper that I've used in my own research. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. From Teresa Amabile, or Amabile, I'm not sure how she pronounces her name. It's a study from 1979, so a long time ago. But it was really applicable to my research, and I will explain why shortly. So what she did was she looked at external evaluation on artistic creativity. It was based in the US at a university setting and involved 95 female students enrolled in an introductory psychology course at Stanford. She used Varimax rotation as a factor analysis, and there was a hypothesis, so this is a quantitative study. The key thing, and the reason why this is important, my research is student-directed assessment, which is what SDA stands for. And this study that Amabile conducted, the pretests show that females were more creative, which is contrary to what I actually found in my studies. So that's why this particular paper is important to me. So remembering again that we're looking at conducting a conceptually organized critical synthesis. So we're going to start mapping concepts, and this is your first task. I'm going to show you an example, and then you're going to be doing your task. So whether you want to do it on the computer or whether you prefer to do it on a big sheet at home and just do a handwritten thing, you can take a photo of it later, it doesn't matter. You put in your question first, as you think it's phrased at the moment. Identify your purpose again, so you know, okay, how does this fit in? Because it helps you focus or sharpen your focus. And then you start identifying. I'd like you to actually identify 2 concepts. You don't have to go for all 3, but in your literature review, in your final proposal, you will probably have 2 or 3 concepts that you're reviewing as part of your literature. And that's where that thematically organized or conceptually organized point fits in, if you like. So I'm going to give you an example from my own research when we start mapping concepts. My research question was, what factors of student-directed assessment help foster students' creative thinking? And my purpose, this was actually an emergent theme in my thesis, was to understand why students demonstrated creative risk-taking in their responses. This was an interpretive or an inductive research question, which was part of a whole range of questions in my thesis. But the concepts that I thought would help me answer that research question, what factors of student-directed assessment help foster students' creative thinking, when I was getting my head around it, I thought, well, external evaluation, or EE, was one of those factors. Metacognition, in my thinking, was another factor, and scaffolding, so the teacher's role, was a third factor. So your turn now is, we're going to start small, so I want you to first of all identify your question, your purpose, and if you can do 3 concepts, great. If you can only do 1 or 2, that's fine. Do leave some space around those concepts though, because you're going to be mapping out how people position themselves. And you might want to look at my example just so you know kind of where you're heading with it. So that's your first task, and you will put that up on the forum to kind of break it up. Once you've identified your concepts, you then start actually mapping out where people have positioned themselves, or in order for you to unpack that concept and use that concept to help you answer your research question, you're referring back, and that's where you're comparing, contrasting, and positioning yourself. You're referring to the knowledge that has gone before you. And in this example, in respect to external evaluation, which was one of the concepts that helped me answer factors, my research question, some of the literature had some quite different findings. Amabile, as I showed you before, had an empirical study with 95 adult female participants, and she used factor analysis, and she found that external evaluation had a detrimental effect to the creative responses of those students. Another finding is by Conti, Collins and Piccarello from 2001, and they found that external evaluation had a positive effect on boys' performance. A very different finding, different audiences, different settings, different approaches even, but different findings, which gives me nuance as I'm looking at understanding the role of external evaluation as a factor in fostering students' creative thinking. I've got a third example there as well, from Köstner, Zuckerman and Köstner in '89, and they found that external evaluation had, again, just like Collins and Conti and Piccarello, had a positive effect on boys' performance, and in particular they found that the display of work to a real audience, in their case, had a positive effect on boys, and that's important because there's a connection there too that helps me understand the role of student-directed assessment, because the idea of a real audience was a key aspect in it, which actually then will connect with scaffolding as well, which is another idea. So this is how you start mapping out your concepts, and once you've mapped it out, you will know where you're going with it, particularly if you're fairly kind of logical and a visual learner, it will help you get your head around what you're actually going to talk about. Because in your literature review, where you're exploring those key themes or key concepts that inform you in respect to your research question, you're putting them as a thematic thing. So you might talk about external evaluation as one aspect, and then you're talking about the findings that have come across and how your interpretation of that finding and how it informs you before you move on to the next thing. So you're going to be expanding your map by adding your details of the authors, and that help you compare and contrast those different standpoints and findings when you draft your literature review, which you're in the process of doing. You're going to be talking about it next week, but you're going to be probably writing it more in preparation for your draft proposal. So it's your turn. Once you've mapped out your question, the purpose, and some of the concepts, and this, I know this is a work in process, but I would like to really encourage you to try to narrow it down. So don't have 50 million concepts. Try to actually identify the key things that actually help you answer your question. And it's your judgment. There's no right or wrong in this. This is your call, what you're thinking, and that's what you're justifying. So I thought it would be helpful to, and this is the last thing for today, just reiterate what you're actually doing next week when you're giving your brief presentation or your pitch, if you like, to your peers, which is 5% of your assessment marks. And you're also going to give feedback to your peers, and you've got the template on Moodle. So next week you are going to give a 15-minute presentation of your thinking, if you like, to your peers. You probably will do it as a slideshow with a recorded narration, or you might get someone to film you as you're talking through it, just using a camera or whatever. What you're doing in this is, I should have actually had, there are 3 sections in this rubric, and unfortunately the lines have disappeared. But anyway, the first thing you're doing is you're giving a presentation where you identify the topic and you explain why this is significant, why you've chosen it, and in particular you're articulating your research problem, your research question, and I know that that might change eventually, but your question as it's faced at the moment, your aim, what you're actually seeking to do, and the objectives. So for a pass level, you're going to state your topic. It might be quite broad, and you will address some links to your professional practice as a teacher. And you have included the problem, the question, the aim, and the objectives, but you might not have so much detail. I'm hoping that I'll keep getting emails that are making noises on my computer. I hope it's not being recorded. Anyway, for a credit level, you're showing some more focus in this. You might still be fairly broad, but you establish some pretty clear links to your professional practice, and you clearly outline your research focuses. So you articulate them effectively, and that you're pretty on the ball there. For a distinction, it's specific. And again, you've got clear links, and you are very explicit in articulating those research purposes. This is really the main, actually this and the next one are the main aspects of what you're doing in this brief presentation. For a high distinction, you're quite insightful. You know, you might be quite creative as well, and you're showing real perceptiveness, if that's even a word. Okay, next section, and I apologize about the lines being blurred. You're going to present an outline of the key ideas. That is actually your literature review where you're at the moment. So an outline of the key ideas, concepts, those themes again, that inform your research topic. You're going to include an analysis. This is a work in progress, so it's not going to be final, but it's a pitch and it's a chance for you to get feedback. So you're going to include an analysis and some critique of some of that prior literature, and it might also be current debates on the topic. The main focus is probably on some of the literature you have engaged with. For a pass, it might be quite descriptive rather than necessarily particularly critical. You might have some studies, you might have some debates, you might have a bit of both, but there is some critical thinking evident in what you've got, although most of it might be fairly descriptive. For a credit, you're really showing beginning to show some critical engagement. You are putting forward your interpretations of it, and you're actually making it clear how these ideas inform your research question as it stands. For distinction, your critical thinking is pretty evident. You do show that you have critiqued various prior literature, and it's both seminal, so old but widely cited and highly relevant literature, and some current, i.e. less than 5 years old. For a high distinction, again, you're really perceptive in this, you're quite creative, you're quite innovative, you've got a bit of an X factor happening. The third aspect, and this is going to be a brief part and very kind of grey zone at the moment, but think back to one of those initial concept maps you did where you posited, okay, this is a research question, how could you possibly investigate it? That's essentially what you're doing in this third part. You're talking about how you think you might, what kind of design, and I know we haven't spoken about design sampling and so on in any great detail, but you're probably articulating your general approach. If you think you're going to be using a deductive approach or an inductive approach, some of the ways you might collect data as you understand it now, and you explaining how it will help you answer your research question. And that's it. You've only got a 15-minute presentation. You need to upload it onto Moodle, and you will need to give feedback to your peers. You will have the weekend, and the expectation is that you've been grouped into groups of 3, so you need to give feedback to the 2 other people in your group plus another one. So you should all be getting some feedback that you can use and reflect on as you continue to develop your thinking and as you develop your draft, which is actually part C. I haven't included those details there, but it's a work in progress. So it's kind of this is actually a formative assessment in that you're getting feedback and it helps you shape your ideas as you develop your thinking further. That's it. Thank you very much. Is that stopping?